Under the vast, starless sky, the highway stretched like a ribbon of asphalt, slicing through the quiet night. Michael Harris gripped the steering wheel of his sedan, the hum of the engine a steady companion to the stillness between him and his wife, Sarah. She sat beside him, her head resting against the window, one hand gently cradling the curve of her pregnant belly. The soft glow of the dashboard lights illuminated her thoughtful expression, her eyes distant but warm with dreams of the future. "I've been thinking," Sarah said softly, her voice barely rising above the hum of the tires on the road. "What if we name him Ethan?" Michael glanced at her, his lips twitching into a faint smile. One hand stayed steady on the wheel, while the other reached across to clasp hers. Her fingers, warm and familiar, curled around his. "Ethan," he repeated, letting the name settle in the air. Strong name. Sarah's smile widened, her gaze locking with his. "I knew you'd like it." The road ahead was empty, the night thick with unspoken promises, a new life, a new chapter. But then a flicker of red and blue pierced the rearview mirror. Michael's eyes narrowed, his instincts sharpening as the patrol car's headlights flared closer. Sarah's grip on his hand tightened, her voice hesitant. "Do you think—" "It's just a traffic stop," Michael said, his tone calm but firm as he eased the car onto the shoulder. The patrol car followed, pulling in close behind them. He exhaled slowly, his posture steady, though every muscle was primed, alert. Two officers emerged from the cruiser, their boots crunching against the gravel. The first, tall and broad-shouldered, approached Michael's window with a smirk that seemed etched into his face. His badge read, Calloway. The second, stockier, with a restless energy coiled in his movements, circled to Sarah's side. His badge identified him as Reeves. "Evening," Calloway drawled, his voice dripping with authority, meant to unsettle rather than reassure. He leaned down, peering into the car, his eyes scanning Michael with deliberate scrutiny. "Evening, officer," Michael replied, his tone neutral, his expression unreadable. Calloway's smirk widened, his head tilting slightly. "Little late to be out, don't you think?" Michael met his gaze without flinching. Didn't realize there was a curfew. A low chuckle escaped Calloway, but it carried no warmth, only a slow, simmering menace. Reeves, meanwhile, tapped his flashlight against Sarah's window, the sharp sound making her flinch. Michael's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Is there a problem, officer?" Calloway exhaled through his nose, flipping open a notepad with exaggerated nonchalance. "License and registration." Michael moved deliberately, retrieving the documents from the glove compartment and passing them through the window. Calloway took them with a lazy flick of his wrist, barely glancing at them before his eyes drifted to Sarah. His smirk deepened. "That's your wife." Michael's fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but he didn't answer. Something in Calloway's tone set his nerves on edge. The officer's gaze lingered on Sarah's pregnant belly, then flicked back to Michael. "Guess congratulations are in order." "Thanks," Michael said, his voice tight, offering nothing more. Calloway hummed, turning Michael's license over in his hand. His eyes caught on something, and he let out a low whistle. "Military, huh? Delta Force." His smirk grew sharper. "That's supposed to impress me." Michael exhaled, already weary of the game. "Not unless you're hiring." The quip was light, meant to diffuse the tension, but Calloway's smirk vanished, his expression turning cold as ice. A heavy silence stretched between them, broken only by Reeves' low, sharp chuckle. "Funny guy," he muttered. Calloway leaned in closer, his fingers tapping the roof of the car. "You think this is a joke?" Michael's smirk faded, his voice steady. "No, officer, just making conversation." Calloway scoffed, stepping back, but his posture was rigid now, a flicker of something dangerous glinting in his eyes. Then, as if flipping a switch, his smirk returned, sharper than before. "Step out of the vehicle." Michael didn't move. "On what grounds?" Calloway's eyes gleamed with cold amusement. "On the grounds that I said so." Sarah shifted beside him, her voice a whisper. "Michael." Reeves tapped the glass again, Harder this time. You deaf. Michael exhaled slowly, forcing his body to stay relaxed. We haven't done anything wrong. Calloway's smirk widened, his voice low and deliberate. See, that's the thing. It's not about what you did. It's about what I say you did. The words hung in the air, thick with threat. Sarah's grip on Michael's wrist tightened, her eyes darting between the officers. Michael glanced at her, then back at Calloway. He'd seen this before, men who wielded power like a weapon, who thrived on control. He knew how this played out. No matter how he responded, Calloway had already decided his guilt. With a slow, deliberate motion, Michael reached for the door handle. Calloway stepped back, his stance casual but predatory. Waiting. Reeves shifted behind him, his hand resting too close to his holster. Michael stepped out, the cool night air brushing against his skin. He straightened, his presence commanding despite the tension. Calloway sized him up, searching for any crack, any excuse to escalate. He found none, but it didn't matter. Hands on the car, Calloway ordered. Michael didn't move. Reeves let out a slow, amused breath. That was an order. Sarah's voice cut through the night, fragile but pleading. Michael, please. His fists clenched, his mind racing. He'd followed the rules his entire life, de-escalated every confrontation, played by the book. But it had never mattered. Not then, not now. Standing under the pulsing red and blue lights, watching Calloway's smirk twist into something crueler. He knew it never would. With a slow, deliberate motion, he placed his hands on the car. Behind him, Calloway smiled. The night was just beginning. Michael stood rigid, his palms pressed against the cold metal of the car, every sense heightened. He'd faced down warlords, navigated battlefields, and walked away from situations most men wouldn't survive. But this was different. This wasn't a fight he could win with strength or strategy. This was a game rigged from the start, played by men who saw his skin and nothing else. Calloway wasn't looking for compliance. He was looking for a reason to break him. Calloway stood too close, his fingers tapping lazily against his belt, his smirk dripping with mockery. He held Michael's license like it was worthless, barely glancing at it before his lips curled. Delta Force, he muttered, savoring the words. One of those tough guys. Huh. Michael exhaled, his voice steady. Something like that. Calloway chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, I know your type. Michael didn't respond. He didn't need to. Reeves, still prowling around the car like a predator circling its prey, tapped his flashlight against Sarah's window again, the sound sharp and deliberate. Sarah flinched, and Michael's gaze snapped to him, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. Leave her alone. Reeves turned slowly, his smirk mirroring Calloway's. That's supposed to be an order. Michael held his stare, his voice unyielding. That's my wife. You don't talk to her. You don't touch her. You don't even look at her. Calloway let out an amused whistle, his smirk widening as he turned to Sarah. You feel safe with this guy, sweetheart? Sarah's fingers curled tightly in her lap, but her voice was steady, defiant. I felt safer before you pulled us over. Reeves chuckled, pacing around the car. Oh, she's got a mouth on her. Sarah's eyes flashed with fire. And you've got an ego so fragile, it's pathetic. Reeves's smirk vanished, his face darkening. Calloway, sensing the shift, leaned against the car, his posture deceptively relaxed. You know, he mused, his voice slow and deliberate. People like you think you're untouchable. Military hero, pretty wife, kid on the way. But out here, he gestured to the empty highway. Out here, I'm the one in charge. Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He knew better than to give Calloway the reaction he craved. But Sarah, her fear of giving way to anger, leaned forward. You're not in charge of anything. You're just a bully with a badge. Reeves lunged toward her window, his flashlight raised, but Michael moved faster, stepping between the car and the officer. Back off, he said, his voice low, lethal. Calloway's smirk faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly. Stepping forward, "You don't get to give orders here. Tough guy. Step back, or this gets worse." Michael didn't budge. It's already worse. What happened next was a blur of motion and rage. Calloway's hand shot out, grabbing Michael's arm, while Reeves yanked open Sarah's door. She screamed, struggling as Reeves pulled her from the car. Michael spun, breaking Calloway's grip with a precision born of years in combat. But before he could reach Sarah, Calloway slammed him against the car, his forearm pressed against Michael's throat. Sarah hit the ground hard, her hands instinctively shielding her belly. "Stop," she cried, her voice breaking. "I'm pregnant." Reeves froze, but Calloway didn't flinch. His smirk returned, colder than ever. "Should have thought about that before you mouthed off." Michael's vision tunneled, rage coursing through him like wildfire. With a single, fluid motion, he twisted free, shoving Calloway back. But before he could act, Reeves drew his taser, the crackle of electricity cutting through the night. "Move again, and you're done," he snarled. Michael froze, his eyes locked on Sarah, crumpled on the ground, her breathing shallow but steady. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to end this here and now. But he couldn't risk her. Not now. Not ever. Calloway dusted off his hands, his smirk triumphant. "Take this as a lesson," he said, tossing Michael's license to the ground. "Next time, it won't be so easy." The officers sauntered back to their cruiser, their laughter echoing in the night. They drove off, leaving Michael and Sarah alone on the desolate highway. Michael dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he helped her sit up. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice raw. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "The baby. I think he's okay." Michael pulled her close, his heart pounding. He'd spent his life fighting for justice, believing in the system. But tonight, the system had failed him. It had failed Sarah. It had failed their unborn child. As he helped Sarah back into the car, something shifted inside him. Calloway and Reeves thought they'd walked away untouchable, just like they always had. But they'd made a mistake. They'd crossed the wrong man. Michael Harris wasn't just a former Delta Force commander. He was a husband, a father-to-be, a man who'd seen enough injustice to know when the rules no longer applied. The officers would go home tonight, smug and unpunished. But their time was coming. Michael wasn't waiting for justice anymore. He was going to deliver it himself. As the night air thickened with tension, Michael felt the weight of every glance and word exchanged. He caught the glint in Calloway's eye, a smug appraisal directed at Sarah, his wife, who sat rigid beside him. "I can see why you married her," Calloway drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "She's a pretty little thing, but you've got to teach her when to hold her tongue." Michael's breath hitched, slow and deliberate, his hands tightening just enough to betray the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. His pulse thudded steadily, his mind already mapping the distance between him and the two officers, calculating their movements, their intent. Sarah's voice sliced through the air, sharp and unyielding. "Don't talk about me like I'm not sitting right here." Her words carried a controlled fury, her eyes blazing as she leaned forward in her seat. Calloway's lips curled into a wider, more predatory grin. "Oh, don't worry, sweetheart. I see you just fine," he said, his tone mocking. Michael shifted forward, just an inch, but it was enough to make his presence felt. His voice dropped, low and dangerous. "And I see you," for a fleeting moment. Calloway's smirk wavered, but he quickly recovered, his arrogance snapping back into place. "Damn, this one's got some fire," he muttered to his partner. Reeves, who was still stewing from Sarah's defiance. Reeves seized the opportunity, his voice venomous. That's what happens when they forget their place. Michael exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering to Sarah. Her knuckles were white, gripping the edge of her seat as if anchoring herself against the rising tide of hostility. Calloway, sensing the shift in the air, turned back to Michael, his voice dropping to a taunting whisper. "Keep this up, Graves, and I'll start thinking you've got something to hide." Michael forced his body to relax, his fingers uncurling, his face a mask of indifference. He knew their game. They wanted him to break, to give them an excuse. He wouldn't, but he wouldn't stay silent either. I haven't done anything, he said, each word measured and deliberate. My wife hasn't done anything. You pulled us over because you could, not because of any law. And now you're trying to bait me. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. That means I've already won. Calloway's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. Reeves's smirk twisted into something uglier, the kind of look that promised trouble. Calloway straightened, his hand resting casually on his belt near his handcuffs. Yeah, I think I've had about enough of this, he said, stepping closer. Turn around, hands behind your back. Sarah's voice rose, sharp with alarm. What for? What? Calloway didn't even glance her way. His eyes locked on Michael's. Driving under the influence, he said. The accusation as flimsy as it was infuriating. Michael's patience frayed, his exhale sharp. You know that's not true. Calloway's grin stretched wider, all teeth and menace. Then prove me wrong. Sarah leaned forward, her voice trembling with rising panic. He hasn't been drinking, and you know it. Reeves scoffed, stepping closer, his irritation boiling over. Damn, woman. Do you ever shut up? Michael's head snapped toward him, his voice pure ice. Touch her, and I swear you won't make it home tonight. Reeves froze, caught off guard. But Calloway let out a slow, exaggerated sigh, shaking his head as if dealing with a tiresome child. This is why I don't like your type, he said, his tone mocking. Always thinking you're the smartest guy in the room. Always thinking you're the toughest. Michael's voice grew quieter, colder. I don't think anything. Calloway's chuckle was thin, strained, the tension slipping from his control. His grip tightened on his belt. Last chance. Turn around. Hands behind your back. Michael felt Sarah's organ on him, wide with fear, her breath uneven. He could sense her bracing for what might come next. If he fought back now, it wouldn't end here, not tonight. Not with her so close. Slowly, deliberately. He turned. Calloway's grin returned, triumphant. As he grabbed Michael's wrist with unnecessary force, the cuffs snapped down, biting into his skin, the metal cold and cruel. Calloway yanked Michael's arms back, pulling harder than needed, just to prove who held the power. Michael clenched his jaw, swallowing the sting, refusing to give them the reaction they craved. He heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath, felt her shift in her seat as if she wanted to leap out, to intervene, but she held back for now. Calloway shoved him forward, slamming him against the side of the car. Welcome to the real world. Hero, he muttered, his voice smug. Michael didn't flinch, didn't react. Even as the night air grew heavier, pressing against his skin, kneeling on the rough pavement, his muscles coiled, his breath slow and steady, he knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't about the law. Calloway and Reeves were following a script they'd written themselves, one where they decided who was guilty, who was powerless. Michael had played along as he could, but there were lines he wouldn't let them cross. Calloway's hand pressed down on his shoulder, fingers digging in, forcing him lower. That's better, he murmured, his voice thick with satisfaction. See you listen, and this doesn't have to get messy. Michael's jaw tightened, his wrists straining against the cuffs. He could hear Sarah's uneven breathing from the car, could feel the intensity of her gaze, her hands likely gripping the dashboard so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Michael, she called, her voice laced with warning, with fear. Calloway sighed dramatically, shaking his head. Your wife sure does talk a lot. Michael ignored him, forcing his breathing to stay even. You've got what you wanted, he said, his voice steady. You made your point. Let's get this over with. Reeves let out a short, mocking laugh, stepping closer. Oh no, we're not done yet. He crouched slightly, meeting Michael's gaze with a predatory glint. Gotta pat you down, make sure you're not hiding anything. Michael didn't move, didn't blink. You've already got me in cuffs. Reeves grinned. Yeah, But we like to be thorough. Calloway leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Unless you want to make this difficult. Michael exhaled slowly, knowing where this was headed. Before he could respond, Sarah's voice cut through again, sharp and fearless, despite her fear. He's in cuffs. He can't do anything. This is harassment, and you know it. Reeves rolled his eyes, his patience wearing thin. Lady, I swear, if you don't shut up. Michael cut him off, his voice like a blade. You don't talk to her like that. Reeves tilted his head, something dark flashing in his eyes. He glanced at Calloway, smirking. Hear that? He's real protective. Calloway nodded, playing along. Yeah, thinks he can tell us how to do our jobs. Reeves stepped behind Michael, grabbing his shoulders with a grip that was far too rough. Let's fix that attitude, he said, yanking Michael forward, forcing him lower to the ground. Michael's knee scraped against the pavement, but he didn't react. Wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Sarah, however, had reached her breaking point. Stop it, you're hurting him, she shouted, her voice trembling with rage. Calloway sighed, glancing toward the car as if she were a mere annoyance. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Michael twisted slightly, despite the pressure on his back, his voice sharper now. Leave her alone. Reeves chuckled, low and menacing. See, this is your problem. Graves, always trying to play the hero. Before Michael could respond, Sarah was out of the car, her steps quick and determined as she stormed toward them. You can't do this. He hasn't done anything wrong. Reeves turned toward her, exhaling hard, his patience gone. All right, I've had enough of this. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a force that made Michael's blood boil. Michael saw red. His body moved before his mind could catch up, twisting against the cuffs, his muscles straining as every instinct screamed to break free, to protect her. Calloway shoved him down hard, barking, "Stay down." But Michael barely registered it. His focus was on Sarah, who yanked her arm back with force, stumbling but regaining her balance, her eyes blazing with defiance. Get your hands off me, she snapped. Reeves lunged again, grabbing her other arm, his grip tightening as he pulled her toward him. Sarah fought back, twisting and pushing against him, her voice rising in desperation. Let go of me. Michael thrashed, trying to push up, to get to her, his heart pounding in his chest. Then came the sharp crackle of electricity. Pain exploded through Michael's body, his back arching as the taser's voltage tore through him. His muscles seized, his nerves screaming in a white-hot blaze of agony. The world blurred, his breath vanishing as he collapsed to the pavement, his body twitching uncontrollably. Through the haze, he heard Sarah scream. Forcing himself to move, Michael pushed past the burning in his limbs, the electricity still coursing through him. He lifted his head just in time to see Reeves slam Sarah to the ground. The impact was brutal, her body twisting as she instinctively curled around her stomach, a sharp, strangled gasp escaping her lips before silence fell. Michael didn't think, didn't hesitate. The pain in his body was nothing compared to the fire in his chest. All he knew was that Sarah was down, that they had done this. His heartbeat roared in his ears as he surged forward, despite the hands holding him down. Calloway moved first, his boot pressing into Michael's back, pinning him to the pavement. Where do you think you're going? He taunted, his voice sharp and cruel. Michael struggled, his teeth gritted, his entire body straining against the weight, against the cuffs, against the injustice of it all. Another burst of pain loomed on the horizon, but his focus remained singular, Sarah. He wouldn't let them break her. Break them. Not tonight, not ever. The taser's jolt ripped through Michael again, a vicious surge that drained the strength from his limbs, forcing him to the ground. His vision flickered, the world blurring at the edges, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. Yet, even as his body betrayed him, his eyes stayed locked on her era, crumpled on the pavement. Her breath shallow, her hands clutching her stomach as if trying to hold herself together. Above her, Officer Reeves stood tall, rolling his shoulders with a heavy exhale, like he'd just finished a grueling workout. She should have stayed in the car, he muttered, his voice thick with disdain. Officer Calloway, adjusting his belt with a smirk, glanced down at Michael. Guess that's 2 arrests tonight, huh? Michael barely registered their words, barely felt the cuffs biting into his wrists or the rough scrape of the pavement against his cheek. Something deeper, something darker, had taken root inside him, a quiet, terrible stillness. This wasn't over. Not for them, not for him. As the officers loomed over him, chuckling, convinced they'd won, Michael made a silent vow. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed, but they would soon enough. The cold pavement pressed against his face, an unyielding anchor holding him in place even as every fiber of his body screamed to move. The taser's electric bite had faded, leaving his muscles twitching, slowly clawing their way back to life. But his mind was untouched, burning with a fire that refused to dim. The rage coiled tight in his gut, patient, waiting. Then he heard Sarah's soft, breathless cries. Not loud, not sobbing, just fragile gasps, like she was fighting to breathe through the pain and losing. The sound carved into him, deeper than the bruises blooming across his ribs, deeper than the metal cuffs cutting into his skin. He forced his head up, his vision swimming before it settled on her. She was still on the ground, curled into herself, arms wrapped protectively around her stomach, trembling. Reeves towered over her, his grin sharp and cruel, like he was proud of the wreckage he'd caused. Michael's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached, threatening to crack under the pressure. Calloway let out a low, mocking chuckle, stepping back with a relaxed swagger, utterly at ease with the chaos he'd helped create. "Man," he said, shaking his head, "look at you two." He nudged Michael's side with his boot, not hard enough to hurt, just enough to remind him who held the power. What happened to all that fight, huh? Michael's fingers twitched against the pavement, his body taut, his breath slow and deliberate through his nose. He didn't answer. Not yet. Reeves crouched slightly near Sarah, his voice dripping with mockery. "She's a lot quieter now, ain't she?" Michael's vision pulsed red. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her body shifting as she tried to sit up. The moment she moved, Calloway let out a taunting whistle. "Uh-oh, look alive. Graves, your lady's trying to get up." Michael's breath hitched, his muscles straining against the cuffs, shoulders burning with the effort. Calloway's boot pressed harder against his back, pinning him down. Sarah's voice, barely a whisper, cut through the haze. "Michael." Calloway's smirk widened. "Oh, she's calling for you." "Cute," Reeves laughed, the sound grating. "Smug." Michael's breathing deepened, steady and controlled. He knew this game. He'd seen it before, men in different uniforms, under different flags, wielding power like a Tisido, reveling in it. They weren't just enforcing the law, they were savoring the cruelty. He closed his eyes for a fleeting moment, forcing the rage to simmer, to stay coiled just beneath the surface. Not now, but soon. Calloway crouched lower, his voice a mocking drawl. "This what you trained for, soldier boy." He patted Michael's back, the gesture dripping with condescension, as if they were old pals instead of enemies locked in a silent war. All that time in the desert, all that discipline, all that fight, just to end up face down in the dirt while your wife cries. Michael opened his eyes, his gaze locking onto Calloway's slow, deliberate, and heavy with something so dark and calm it made the officer's smirk falter. Just for a second. A flicker of unease crossed Calloway's face before he recovered, exhaling sharply through his nose. "Yeah, that's what I thought," he muttered, shaking his head. Reeves stepped back, wiping his hands together like he was dusting off after a job well done. "All right, let's get him into the car." Michael barely felt himself being yanked to his feet, his body moving on instinct, balance adjusting even as Reeves shoved him forward toward the patrol car. "Sarah," he rasped, turning his head, his breath catching when he saw her still on the ground, trembling, her face pale. But her eyes were fixed on him, desperate, terrified, pleading and carrying something else, something broken. He didn't look away, not even as Reeves slammed him against the patrol car, forcing him inside. He let her see him, let her see that this wasn't the end, that it would never be the end. Sarah was still watching as Calloway grabbed her arm, yanking her up with a roughness that made her stumble, her face twisting in pain, her free hand still clutching her stomach. Michael's teeth ground together, his breathing slow, measured, barely holding the fury in check. Their eyes met one last time before the patrol car door slammed shut, cutting her off from view. The world outside the car blurred into flashing lights, dark silhouettes, and the distant murmur of voices, underscored by the quiet hum of radio static. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears, his hands flexing uselessly against the cuffs as the car lurched forward, pulling them away from the scene, toward whatever came next. Calloway drove, Reeves in the passenger seat, both far too relaxed, too comfortable with what they'd just done. The radio crackled faintly, but the car was otherwise silent, too silent until Calloway sighed, glancing at Michael in the rearview mirror. "You know," he mused, "I really don't get guys like you." Michael didn't respond, didn't move. Calloway pressed on, clearly enjoying the sound of his own voice. "You get out of the service, get yourself a nice little life, a pretty little wife, and still, you can't help yourself. Gotta be the tough guy. Gotta act like you're in charge." Reeves snorted. "Yeah, how'd that work out for you tonight?" Michael stared out the window, the town passing in a haze of streetlights and shadowed storefronts. Calloway hummed, undeterred. "See, that's what I don't get. You're smart, right? Gotta be, to make it through all that training. So you had to know how this was gonna go. You had to know the second you started running your mouth, you were ending up in cuffs." Michael finally spoke, his voice low, steady, cutting through the air like a blade. "You were gonna do this no matter what I said." Calloway let out a short, amused laugh. "See, smart guy." Michael turned his head just enough to meet Calloway's eyes in the mirror, his voice calm, too calm. "So why ask questions you already know the answers to?" Calloway's smirk twitched. Reeves chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, you just don't know when to quit." Michael held Calloway's gaze a moment longer before looking away, not in defeat, not in submission, but because this wasn't the moment. Not yet. The station's harsh lights loomed ahead, bright and sterile, slicing through the night. The car slowed, pulling into the lot, coming to a stop outside the processing area. Calloway turned in his seat, grinning over his shoulder. "Well, soldier boy," he said, "welcome to your new home." Michael exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing, his body still, his mind already racing ahead. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The holding cell's walls closed in around him, the dim yellow light casting jagged shadows across the concrete floor. The air was thick, stale, heavy with the weight of confinement. Michael's body ached from the night before, his muscles stiff from hours spent on the cold bench, his wrists raw from cuffs that had been fastened too tightly for too long. But none of it mattered, not compared to Sarah. Sitting beside him, hunched forward, arms wrapped around herself, her breaths uneven and slow. She hadn't spoken in minutes, barely moved, her eyes fixed blankly on the floor, her fingers curled tightly in her lap, gripping nothing. Michael exhaled, forcing the rage pressing against his ribs to stay in check, focusing on her, not on the officers laughing at the front desk, not on Reeves, who'd already sauntered past their cell twice, smirking like he'd claimed some kind of victory. He shifted closer, his voice low but firm. "Sarah." She didn't move, didn't acknowledge him. His throat tightened. He reached for her hand, careful, as if she might break under his touch. She let him take it, but her grip was weak, her fingers barely curling around his. That was when the rage in his chest sharpened into something heavier, colder, something that sank into his bones like iron. He turned toward the bars, his voice slicing through the silence, sharp enough to make the officers at the desk glance up. She needs a doctor. No response. He forced himself to stay still, to breathe, to keep his hands from curling into fists. He tried again, his voice harder, his patience fraying. She needs a doctor. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, barely looked up from his paperwork. She looks fine, he muttered, flipping a page. Michael's body went utterly still. Every ounce of discipline, every rule he'd lived by, every lesson he'd learned, straining against the fire now roaring inside him. The air in the room hung heavy, teetering on the brink of something catastrophic. Then his voice sliced through the tension low, steady, and carrying a quiet menace that could stop a heartbeat. You're getting her a doctor. Now. The officer froze, his pen hovering over the paper, fingers twitching as if caught in a moment of indecision. The younger one next to him flicked his eyes up, cautious, like he'd just sensed a storm brewing. Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, until the older officer muttered, Fine, I'll call someone. Michael didn't flinch, didn't let a single crack of relief show on his face. This wasn't kindness, it was survival, hard-won and precarious. Minutes crawled by, each one heavier than the last, until the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. A woman in medical scrubs appeared, her presence sharp and purposeful. She didn't waste time, her gaze sweeping over Sarah, assessing her condition with a practiced eye before turning to the officer. She needs a hospital, immediately. The officer's brow furrowed, his mouth opening to protest, but Michael was already on his feet. The bench beneath him screeched against the floor as he stood, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Now. The officer hesitated, locked in Michael's unyielding stare. Then, with a slow, grudging exhale, he reached for his radio, muttering something low and clipped. Keys jangled. The lock clicked, and two more officers stepped in. They guided Sarah toward the door, her movement slow, unsteady. She turned just before they let her out, her eyes finding Michael's, wild and searching. I'll be there, he said, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. She gave a faint nod, and then she was gone. The door slammed shut with a hollow clang. Michael didn't move, rooted to the spot, his breath even, his hands loose at his sides, his face a mask of unreadable calm. From the front desk, the low hum of laughter started up again. Murmurs, a chuckle, the clink of a coffee mug. They thought it was over, just another night in their routine world. They had no idea. Time warped after that, hours bleeding into one another, the weight of waiting pressing down like a physical force. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering intermittently, while distant voices droned on, meaningless and far away. Michael didn't sleep, didn't even close his eyes. He sat on the bench, spine straight, hands resting on his knees, waiting with a patience that felt like defiance. Eventually, a new officer appeared, not Calloway, not Reeves, just some young kid who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He fumbled with the keys, unlocking the door and stepping back as if Michael might lunge at him. You're free to go. Sign here. Michael rose slowly, rolling his shoulders to shake off the stiffness that had settled into his muscles, the ache that had burrowed deep into his bones. Where's my wife? His voice was calm, but it wasn't a question. It was a demand that left no room for evasion. The officer shifted, uneasy. Hospital. They released her an hour ago. Michael's pulse thundered in his ears, his jaw tightening. What happened? The officer avoided his gaze, already turning back toward the hall. Ask her yourself. For a moment, Michael didn't move, his eyes boring into the officer's retreating figure. A sharp, quiet tremor pulsed through him, something heavy and final settling in his chest. Then he walked out. The early morning air hit him like a shock, crisp and biting, the rising sun glaring against the dull throb in his skull. Exhaustion dragged at his limbs, but he barely registered it, because there she was, Sarah, standing just a few feet away. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her posture brittle, her face pale and drawn, her eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, locked onto his, and in that moment, something inside her seemed to fracture. Michael crossed the distance before she could move, his hands finding hers, his touch careful but firm, grounding her in the chaos. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around his, her body trembling faintly. She looked up at him, her lips parting, but her voice broke before she could form the words. When she finally spoke, it was barely a whisper, raw and jagged. "He's gone." Michael's entire body went still, the world narrowing to the weight of those two words. Sarah swallowed hard, her fingers digging into his. "The baby." Her voice cracked, her breath catching in her throat. "Ethan, he's gone." Michael stared at her, his mind refusing to process the words, his body frozen in a moment that felt like it shouldn't exist. Something inside him splintered, slow and devastating, the kind of break that left no hope of repair. Sarah wasn't crying, she'd already spent all her tears. Now there was only emptiness, a void where something irreplaceable used to be. His jaw tightened, his breath slow and deliberate, as if he could hold himself together through sheer will. Sarah shook her head faintly, her grip on him tightening, her body swaying just enough to betray her unsteadiness. And then Michael moved. He pulled her into his arms, wrapping her tightly against his chest as she trembled, the weight of their shared loss pressing down on them both. His fingers curled into the fabric of her shirt, his jaw resting against the top of her head as he exhaled, slow and controlled, feeling the faint rhythm of her heartbeat against him. He didn't speak. There were no words for this, no way to articulate the depth of what had been stolen. They stood there, unmoving, while the world carried on around them, cars passing, birds stirring in the dawn, life continuing as if their entire future hadn't been shattered in a single night. Michael's grip tightened just a fraction, holding her closer, as if he could shield her from the grief that threatened to swallow them whole. There was no anger yet, no burning fury. That would come later. For now, there was only this, the quiet devastation, the unbearable silence where their son should have been, and Sarah, shaking in his arms. "Miriam!" The house felt wrong the moment they stepped inside. It wasn't just the stillness, thick and oppressive, sinking into the walls like a permanent fixture. It wasn't the dim light filtering through the drawn curtains, casting long, muted shadows across the furniture. It was something deeper, something that made the space feel foreign, like a place they no longer belonged. Michael lingered in the doorway, his hand still curled around the handle, his breath slow and steady, his pulse a quiet drum in his ears. He'd walked through this door countless times, knew every detail by heart, the creak of the floorboards, the faint scent of Sarah's morning coffee, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But now, those familiar pieces felt distant, like fragments of a life that no longer existed. Sarah moved past him, her steps slow and hesitant, as if she, too, was stepping into a stranger's home. She didn't kick off her shoes, didn't flick on the lights, didn't head for the couch or the kitchen or their bedroom. She just stood there, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her gaze fixed on some invisible point, lost in a place Michael couldn't follow. He let the door close behind him, the soft click sounding too loud in the suffocating quiet. His voice was low, careful. "What did the doctor say?" Sarah's breath hitched, a sharp, fleeting sound, but she didn't answer right away. Michael took a step closer, his tone steady but insistent. "Sarah." She blinked, her shoulders stiffening, as if she'd forgotten he was there. Slowly she exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper, hollow and fragile. "They said." She hesitated, her fingers curling into the sleeves of her shirt. There was nothing they could do. Michael felt something tighten in his chest, sharp and unrelenting. He swallowed, forcing the words out. "Was it from the fall?" Sarah nodded, the movement so slight it was almost imperceptible, her eyes still unfocused. "They said the impact was too much, too sudden." Her breath wavered, fragile as glass. I already knew. Before they told me, I felt it. Michael's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides before he forced himself to relax, to breathe, to stay still. His mind flashed back to that moment at the way she'd gasped, the way her body had curled in on itself, the way she'd tried to hold on to something that was already slipping away. His voice was quiet, barely audible. Did they treat you? Sarah nodded again, slower this time. They ran tests. Did an ultrasound? Her breath caught, a faint hitch in her voice. There was no heartbeat. The words landed like a physical blow, sinking deep into a part of him that hadn't yet caught up with the rest. No heartbeat. He closed his eyes for a fleeting second, just long enough to press the weight of it into his chest, his bones, the quiet storm building beneath his skin. Sarah let out a shaky breath. They gave me something for the pain. Her arms tightened around herself, her voice barely audible. Not that it matters. Michael opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on her. He didn't move toward her yet, didn't reach out, because he knew if he touched her now, if he let himself feel the full weight of what they'd mucked, the grief would consume them both. One of them had to hold on, even if it was just for a little longer. He exhaled slowly. Did they say anything else? Sarah shook her head. They told me to rest, to come back if there were complications. A hollow laugh escaped her, so faint it barely registered. Like I'd want to go back. Michael's jaw flexed. He understood exactly what she meant. She lifted a hand to her face, pressing the heel of her palm against her temple, her breath uneven. I keep thinking, her voice faltered, cracking at the edges. I keep thinking about how I was holding him, like that could have protected him. Michael's stomach twisted, a sharp, visceral pain. Sarah shook her head, her eyes wet but the tears refusing to fall. I couldn't save him. He stepped forward before she could say another word, closing the distance between them. His hands found hers, steady and firm, pulling her gently toward him. Sarah, he said, his voice low but unwavering. You did everything you could. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, and for a moment it was as if she was trying to believe him. But the weight of her guilt, her grief, was too heavy. She shook her head again, her voice breaking. It wasn't enough. Michael pulled her into his arms, wrapping her tightly against him, as if he could shield her from the pain, even for a moment. She trembled in his embrace, her fingers clutching at his shirt, her breath ragged. He didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. They stood there, locked in their shared sorrow, as the house loomed around them, silent and empty, a hollow echo of the life they'd once dreamed of. In the quiet of their shattered home, Michael stood in the dim glow of the living room, his hands resting heavily on his knees, fingers curled loosely as if grasping for something that no longer existed. His gaze was lost in the shadows, fixed on nothing, while the silence of the house pressed against him, broken only by the faint creak of floorboards from the bedroom where Sarah moved. It was past midnight, and sleep had abandoned them both, leaving only the raw ache of a life that had been torn apart. He had tried to hold on to the fragments of what they once had, for her sake, for the faint hope of normalcy. But every time he closed his eyes, the images flooded back. Sarah crumpled on the ground, her breath sharp and ragged, her arms wrapped protectively around the child they would never meet. He saw the faces of the men who had done this, Calloway's mocking laugh, Reeves's smug smirk as they loomed over them, untouchable, as if their cruelty carried no weight, as if the world would never demand they pay for it. Michael's breath came slow and measured, the only sign of the storm building inside him, the way his fingers pressed into his knees, knuckles whitening under the strain. The grief was a heavy, unyielding weight in his chest. But beneath it, something colder was taking root, something sharp and deliberate. He had spent his life mastering control, honing it through years of war, through battles that should have broken him. He had walked through fire, always knowing how to keep his emotions in check, how to calculate every move with precision. But this wasn't a battlefield, not in the way he knew. This was home, and they had brought the war to him. His jaw tightened, his breath steady but deliberate. As he rose to his feet, his body feeling too heavy, too confined. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, where the bedroom door stood closed. Sarah inside, lying on her side, staring blankly at the wall, her breaths too soft, too fragile. She hadn't spoken much since they returned, hadn't eaten the food he prepared, hadn't turned on the TV, hadn't reached for him again. She simply existed in a space that no longer felt like hers. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, his jaw clenching harder. He had been patient, had followed the rules, had let himself believe, if only for a fleeting moment, that justice might still exist in this world, that if he waited, someone would be held accountable. But he knew better. He had known it from the moment they locked him in that cell, from the sound of their laughter, from the way Calloway had met his gaze with that infuriating smirk. They had done this, and they would walk free unless he acted. His hands flexed at his sides, and he swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe slowly, to stay grounded, to keep the instinct to move at bay until he was certain how far he was willing to go. A soft sound broke the silence, the quiet shuffle of footsteps behind him. He turned his head slightly, and there was Sarah, standing in the hallway, wrapped in a blanket she clutched tightly to her chest. Her eyes were shadowed, her posture small and fragile, as if she might shatter under the weight of her own existence. He straightened instinctively, smoothing the sharp edges of his thoughts, pushing them carefully beneath the surface. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him, and for a moment he feared she might see it, the shift in his stance, the squaring of his shoulders, the way his body was bracing for something she wasn't ready to confront. But she didn't. Her voice was soft, barely audible. "You're angry." Michael inhaled slowly, his eyes steady on hers, his fingers flexing once before he forced them to still. He nodded once. Yes. Sarah studied him, her expression unreadable, her grip on the blanket tightening. "I've never seen you like this before." He held her gaze, unflinching. "I've never felt like this before." She swallowed, her breath unsteady, her voice softer now. "I don't know what to do with it." Michael exhaled, his jaw flexing slightly. "You don't have to do anything." Sarah let out a breath that was almost a broken laugh, shaking her head, her eyes glistening with something raw and unspoken. "How can you say that?" Her voice trembled, and she looked away, her words spilling out in a rush. "I can't just sit here. Michael, I can't just exist like this, knowing they're still out there, knowing they get to go home, sleep, live their lives like nothing happened." Her voice caught, and she stopped, her breath hitching. Michael stepped forward before he could stop himself, his hands moving to her arms, grounding her, holding her steady. She didn't pull away, but she trembled beneath his touch, her fragility cutting into him like a blade. He kept his voice low, steady. "I know." She exhaled sharply, blinking rapidly, shaking her head again, her breaths uneven. "Then what are we supposed to do?" He didn't answer right away, because the truth wasn't something she was ready to hear, not yet. His grip on her arms tightened slightly, his voice unwavering. "Right now, we grieve." Sarah swallowed hard, her gaze flicking away, her fingers tightening in the blanket's fabric. For a long moment, she just stood there, breathing, struggling to hold herself together. Then, finally, she nodded. Michael released her arms, his fingers lingering just a moment before falling to his sides. Sarah stepped back, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come to bed." His jaw flexed, his hands clenching once before relaxing. He nodded once. She turned slowly, her footsteps soft against the floor as she disappeared down the hall, the bedroom door creaking slightly as she pushed it open. Michael didn't follow right away. He stood in the dim light of the living room, his breath even, controlled, feeling the weight of their exchange settle deep into his ribs. Sarah had always been his anchor, the one who kept him steady, who reminded him who he was when the world tried to strip him bare. But now there was no steadying this, no pulling back, no stopping what had already begun to take shape in his mind. He inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a moment before turning to follow her path. For now, he buried the thoughts, tucking them beneath the grief, because Sarah needed him here, needed his anger to stay contained, needed him to be the man she could still recognize, but not forever, never forever. Calloway and Reeves had taken everything: their future, their Yiquam, the child they would never hold, and the world had let them walk away. No one was coming for them no police, no judge, no courtroom would hold them accountable. The system didn't punish men like them, men who wielded power like a weapon and laughed in the face of consequence. But Michael could. His grief was no longer just pain. It was fuel, sharpening into something cold, something precise. He had spent his life following orders, mastering discipline, carrying out missions to keep the world in balance. Now it was time to apply that knowledge to something personal. This was a war, and he knew exactly how to fight it. His movements were deliberate as he stepped away from the window, retrieving his phone from the table, his mind already mapping out the steps. He couldn't act yet, not without knowing everything, not without the advantage. First, he had to find them. He pulled up the county records, his fingers steady as he navigated the system, scanning names, filtering information. Every officer's residence was public record if you knew where to look, if you understood how to move through databases, how systems were built. Nothing was truly hidden. It didn't take long. Calloway's name appeared, and with it, an address. Michael's breath steadied, his focus narrowing, the grief and anger crystallizing into purpose. This was just the beginning. In a quiet corner of the town's north side, just beyond the rusted skeleton of the old industrial district, stood a two-story house nestled in a cul-de-sac. Its wide driveway gleamed under the streetlights, the lawn clipped to perfection, every blade in place. The man who lived there, Calloway, was alone, no wife, no children, just him and the silence of a house too big for one. Across town, near the hum of the highway, was another home, a rental chosen for its proximity to the police department rather than any sense of warmth or permanence. Reeves lived there, a man engaged to a woman who remained a stranger to Michael, blissfully unaware of the darkness her fiancé carried. Michael's jaw tightened as he committed their addresses to memory, the details searing into his mind like coordinates on a battlefield. Knowing where they lived was only the beginning. He needed more: their habits, their routines, the moments when they were exposed, when no one would notice their absence. He needed precision. Michael set his phone down, his breath slow and deliberate, each movement measured as he reached for his jacket draped over a chair. The fabric settled over his shoulders, grounding him, steadying the faint tremor in his hands. Without a pause, he stepped toward the door, locking it behind him as he melted into the night. His footsteps were soundless on the pavement, the cold air brushing against his skin unnoticed. His mind was already racing ahead, mapping out the nights he'd spent watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Anger had once burned through him, reckless and blinding. But that was gone now. This wasn't about fury. This was about justice, the kind no courtroom could deliver, the kind that didn't bow to rank or badge or influence. This was the justice that found men in the shadows when they thought they were safe. The truck's engine growled softly as Michael pulled out of his driveway, merging onto the empty road. His eyes were steady, his pulse even. The war had begun, and the first battle was knowledge. It didn't take long to find Calloway's house. Michael parked a few streets away, slipping into the darkness with the ease of a man trained to move unseen. The neighborhood was still, the kind of place where people locked their doors out of habit but never truly feared what lingered beyond them. He moved with care, sticking to the edges of the shadows, his eyes scanning Calloway's property. A single car sat in the driveway. The house was dark, save for a faint glow spilling from an upstairs window. Calloway was home, alone. Michael exhaled, his breath barely visible in the cold, as he settled into the night, his body motionless, his mind sharp and calculating. He would watch. He would wait. Men like Calloway always believed they were untouchable, and that arrogance was their fatal flaw. Reeves was next. Michael approached his house with the same meticulous care, parking near an abandoned lot and moving through the shadows. The lights inside glowed warmly, the faint flicker of a television illuminating the living room. Reeves's fiancée was home, her laughter carrying faintly through the window, oblivious to the kind of man she'd chosen to love. Michael watched for hours, his gaze unwavering. Reeves arrived late, his posture loose, unguarded, as if the world held no threats for him. He didn't glance over his shoulder, didn't check the shadows. He had no reason to suspect his life had shifted, that someone was watching, cataloging every move. Michael's breath was slow, deliberate, as Reeves stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him. For now, Michael turned away, vanishing into the night, his mind already sifting through the details, preparing for what would come next. Soon, both Calloway and Reeves would know what it felt like to be prey. Back at his own house, Michael moved through the dim glow of the kitchen, the only light coming from a single bulb above the stove. His motions were slow, methodical, every action infused with purpose. The past few nights had been spent observing, learning, memorizing. He knew Calloway's late-night arrivals, the way he moved through his house without a hint of caution. He'd seen how Reeves carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed he was invincible, never checking his surroundings, never sensing the eyes on him. They were easy targets, lulled into vulnerability by their own complacency. The system had failed, just as Michael had always known it would. No investigations, no consequences, not even a whisper of accountability. Calloway and Reeves had slipped back into their lives as if Ethan's death meant nothing, as if his blood hadn't stained their hands. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, the grief clawing at his chest, heavy and unrelenting. It would never fade, but he couldn't afford to let it consume him. The time for mourning had passed. Now was the time for action. He reached for a small box on the counter, his fingers steady as he opened it. Inside was a collection of tools, gloves, rope, duct tape, a burner phone, and a weapon he hadn't touched in years. Its weight familiar, waiting for a purpose it had finally found. Each item was ordinary on its own, but together they formed something lethal. Michael's breath was slow, his mind running through the plan again, refining every detail, leaving no room for mistakes. Calloway would be first. It had to be him, the one who'd smirked while pinning Ethan to the ground, who'd mocked Sarah, who'd treated their pain like a joke. This wouldn't be quick. Death was too merciful. Calloway needed to feel the weight of his sins, to understand the cost of his actions. Michael spread a hand-drawn map across the counter, his eyes tracing the familiar streets he'd walked in his mind a dozen times. Calloway's house sat in a quiet cul-de-sac, shrouded by limited streetlights, with only one way in and out. His car was always parked in the driveway. No cameras, no security system, no one watching. It was a perfect trap. Michael's finger tapped the edge of the map, his expression unreadable, his pulse steady. He'd scouted the neighborhood, blending into the dark, ensuring no surprises waited. He'd studied the angles, calculated the timing, pinpointed the moment Calloway was most vulnerable right after he stepped through his door, before he locked it, when he still believed himself safe. Michael rolled his shoulders, the tension in his muscles familiar, the anticipation sinking into his bones. He'd spent his life as a soldier, but now he was something else, a hunter. He slipped on the gloves, the material hugging his skin, then pocketed the burner phone, already prepped for what lay ahead. Finally, he reached for the weapon. Its grip settled into his palm, as natural as breathing, though he hadn't fired it in years. He exhaled, flicking off the safety, his body relaxing into the motion, his mind sharpening to a razor's edge. The clock on the stove glowed just past midnight. Calloway would be home in an hour. Michael stepped into the night, leaving his house in silence, his mind already moving through every step, already seeing the moment unfold. By dawn, Calloway would know pain, and justice would finally begin. The night embraced Michael like an old friend, steady and familiar, whispering promises of retribution long overdue. He moved through Calloway's backyard, his steps silent, his breath slow, his pulse unwavering. The house loomed ahead, its back door locked, windows sealed. But Michael was prepared. A lock-picking set rested in his palm as he crouched by the door, his hands working with the precision of experience. The tumblers yielded without protest, the lock giving way, the door easing open just enough for him to slip inside. He closed it softly, standing still, letting the house's quiet settle around him, listening for anything out of place. Nothing. Calloway wasn't home yet. Perfect. Michael moved through the house, his steps careful, his eyes scanning every detail. It was exactly as he'd imagined. Neat, impersonal, a space designed for appearances rather than comfort. Expensive furniture sat untouched. A bar cart gleamed with liquor, poured only to impress. This wasn't a home, it was a stage. Michael's breath was steady as he set the scene, his mind already mapping the moment Calloway would walk through the door, unaware of the shadow waiting to claim him. Michael moved through the house with purpose, his footsteps soft but deliberate, weaving through the living room like a shadow with a mission. He tugged drawers open just enough to make it look like someone had rifled through them, tipping a lamp to the floor with a muted crash, nudging the bar cart so bottles clinked and tilted precariously. A few books were knocked askew, their spines jutting out at odd angles, and a throw blanket was left in a crumpled heap. Every detail was calculated to paint a picture of chaos, of someone tearing through the space in a frantic, careless search. It had to look convincing. It had to feel like a burglary gone wrong. So when Calloway stepped through the door, he'd have no reason to suspect anything else. The scene needed to grip him, to make him believe he was just a victim of cruel chance. That belief would make what came next so much sweeter. Michael slipped into the darkened corner near the hallway, just beyond the kitchen's dim glow. From there, he had a clear view of the front door, the perfect spot to wait, hidden in the shadows. He steadied his breathing, his pulse calm but heavy, and let the silence of the house settle around him. The anticipation was electric, sharpening his senses as he stood motionless, ready. Right on time. At 1:15, the low rumble of Calloway's car rolled into the driveway. Michael's eyes narrowed as he watched through the window, catching the glint of headlights cutting through the night. Calloway stepped out, moving with that infuriating swagger, his shoulders loose, his stride confident. He didn't glance around, didn't pause to check the darkness for threats. He was untouchable, or so he thought, strolling toward the door with the arrogance of a man who believed the world bent to his will. The lock clicked, the door creaked open, and Calloway stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, his body stiffened, his head tilted slightly, his eyes sweeping over the chaos Michael had crafted: the open drawers, the toppled lamp, the scattered objects. His lips parted, a sharp breath catching in his throat as his posture shifted from casual to alert. His fingers twitched near his belt, reaching for a holster that wasn't there. Michael could almost see the gears turning in Calloway's mind, the questions piling up. Burglary, home invasion. Is someone still here? The air grew thick with tension, Calloway's unease palpable as he stood frozen, scanning the room. Michael let the fear take root, let it coil around Calloway's chest, tightening with every second of silence. He waited, patient, until the moment was perfect when Calloway's mind was caught between confusion and instinct, teetering on the edge of action. Then Michael moved. The first strike was swift, a brutal blow to the back of Calloway's head with the butt of his weapon. Calloway stumbled forward, his phone slipping from his hand and hitting the floor with a sharp crack. Before he could recover, before he could even process the pain, Michael was on him. A fist slammed into Calloway's ribs, the impact deep and crushing, forcing a strangled gasp from his lungs. Another hit, this time to the stomach, doubled him over, his knees buckling as his body folded in on itself. Calloway wheezed, struggling to draw breath, but Michael didn't pause. He grabbed the back of Calloway's shirt, yanking him upright, and drove his knee into his gut with ruthless precision. Calloway gagged, his body jerking, his limbs flailing in desperate, panicked bursts. He wasn't fighting back, he couldn't. With a shove, Michael sent him crashing into the coffee table. Liquor bottles toppled, shattering across the floor in a spray of glass and sharp, bitter fumes. Calloway groaned, his body twisting as he clawed at the table, trying to drag himself up. Michael watched for a moment, his head tilted, the rush of adrenaline steady and controlled. This wasn't rage, it wasn't vengeance, it was justice. Cold and deliberate. Calloway's breaths came in ragged bursts, his hands trembling as he tried to push himself up. But Michael was already moving, gripping the back of his head and slamming his face into the hardwood floor. The crack of bone against wood echoed, followed by a sharp, pained inhale. Calloway's body went limp beneath Michael's grip, the fight draining from him as terror began to take hold. Michael pulled zip ties from his pocket, yanking Calloway's arms behind his back and securing them with practiced ease. The plastic bit into Calloway's skin, tight enough to pinch and numb, locking his wrists in place. Kneeling beside him, Michael studied his prey. Calloway was gasping, his forehead pressed against the floor, his body trembling as his mind raced to catch up. To him, this was just a robbery gone wrong, a random stroke of bad luck. Michael let that illusion linger, let Calloway's fear grow, let it swell into something raw and consuming. Calloway swallowed hard, his voice hoarse and shaking. Take whatever you want, he stammered, his breath hitching. Just go. Michael didn't respond. There were things he wanted to say, words clawing at his throat. He wanted to tell Calloway that he knew what it felt like to be helpless, to be pinned down, to feel the weight of someone's knee grinding into his back while the people he loved suffered. He wanted to tell him about every bruise he'd left on Sarah, every moment of pain she'd endured, every breath their son never got to take. He wanted Calloway to know that this was repayment, blow by blow, second by second, for all of it. But he held back. This wasn't about confessions. This was about fear. Reaching for the couch, Michael pulled a pillow to the floor and pressed it beside Calloway's face. A choked, confused noise escaped Calloway's throat. But before he could react, Michael pushed down, cutting off his air. Calloway's body bucked, a sharp, strangled gasp breaking free as his lungs seized in panic. His legs kicked. His fingers twitched uselessly against the zip ties, his muscles straining in desperation. Michael held firm, not long, just enough to let Calloway feel the suffocating weight of helplessness. Then he released. Calloway gasped violently, coughing so hard his body shook. Michael remained still, watching, letting the terror sink deep into Calloway's bones. Slowly, he stood, stepping back into the shadows, leaving Calloway tied, battered, and trembling on the floor. The scene was perfect. By the time someone found him, Calloway would be broken, humiliated, stripped of the power he thought defined him. And the best part, he'd never suspect who was behind it. Michael slipped out into the night, the weight in his chest lighter than it had been in days. One down, one to go. As the first streaks of dawn bled through the horizon, Michael stepped back into his own home. The faint glow of morning slipped through the blinds, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt heavy, pressing against his skin like a living thing. He closed the door silently, peeling off his jacket and rolling his shoulders to ease the tension that had settled there hours ago. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a raw ache in his knuckles and a slow, deliberate rhythm to his breathing. He had done it, for the first time since that night, since the hospital. Since standing outside the police station holding Sarah as she whispered that their son was gone, he felt something stir inside him. Not peace, not relief, but something. Then he felt her gaze. Sarah stood at the end of the hallway, wrapped in one of his old sweatshirts, her bare feet silent against the hardwood. Her arms were crossed, her eyes fixed on him, steady and searching. She hadn't been asleep, not tonight, not since that night. She watched him now, her gaze moving over him in that slow, knowing way she'd always had when she sensed something was off, when she was waiting for him to let her in. Michael exhaled, already knowing there was no hiding from her. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, carrying more weight than words ever could. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. You did something. He held her gaze, unflinching, his hands flexing at his sides before he forced them to still. Yes. Sarah inhaled slowly, her fingers curling into the sleeves of her sweatshirt. Did you kill him? Michael shook his head. No. She studied him, searching his face for something, anything that would betray what he wasn't saying. But Michael had always been hard to read when he chose to be. Then what did you do? Her voice was calm, too calm, like the surface of a lake hiding a storm beneath. He exhaled, running a hand over his jaw before stepping closer, his tone low and steady. I made sure he understood. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact. She knew him, knew what those words meant. Her breath hitched, just slightly, and something unreadable flickered across her face before settling into resolve. She swallowed. Did it help? Michael didn't answer right away. The truth was, he didn't know. The rage still burned, the grief still clawed at his chest, but Calloway had felt fear, and that was something. He exhaled slowly, his voice quieter now. It's not over. Sarah nodded, a barely perceptible movement, her gaze steady. Reeves. Michael's jaw tightened. Yes. Another stretch of silence. Sarah glanced away briefly, her hands tightening around her sleeves before she looked back at him. I want to be there. Michael stilled. He had expected her to argue, to tell him this wasn't the way, to plead for him to stop. But this was something else. Her words hung in the air, heavy with purpose. And for the first time in a long time, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't just pain. It was resolve, sharp and unyielding. In the dim glow of early morning, Michael stood alone in the kitchen, the silence pressing against him like a heavy fog. The creak of the floorboards beneath his feet was the only sound, a faint echo in the stillness of the house. The weight of the night clung to him, sinking into his muscles, wrapping around his bones, refusing to let go. He had expected some kind of release, a moment where the fire in his chest would burn out, leaving nothing but quiet in its wake. But it hadn't come. Maybe it never would. But maybe. Across the room, Sarah's voice sliced through the hush, steady and unyielding. It's not enough. Michael lifted his eyes to meet hers, taking in the way she stood, arms crossed, shoulders squared, her face a mask of determination. She wasn't asking a question or seeking his approval. She was declaring a truth, one they both understood. Michael let out a slow, controlled breath. He had known this moment was coming ever since she'd insisted on being there for the next step. This wasn't just about Calloway anymore, or even Reeves. It was about making sure none of them would ever forget. Sarah's fingers tightened against the fabric of her sleeves, her gaze locked on his, unflinching. They'll recover, she said. Her voice low but laced with something sharp, something raw. They'll lick their wounds, convince themselves it was a one-off. Calloway won't admit what really happened. Reeves will call it a fluke, and the others the ones who stood by, who watched, who laughed while it all went down, they'll still think they're untouchable. Michael gave a single nod, his mind already turning. We changed that. Sarah drew in a slow breath, a flicker of something dark passing across her face. We make sure they know they're never safe. Michael's hands rested on the kitchen table, his fingers flexing briefly before falling still. We tell them, he said, his voice calm but heavy with intent. Sarah tilted her head slightly, waiting for more. Michael straightened, his tone even. Reeves is next. And when we're done, we make sure he knows what happens if he ever touches anyone again. Sarah absorbed his words, her expression unreadable for a moment before she nodded. And Calloway. Michael's jaw tightened. Reeves will tell him, because Reeves would break faster than Calloway ever would. Reeves was reckless, a man who thrived on power but crumbled when it slipped through his fingers. He wouldn't be able to keep it quiet, not forever. Not when the paranoia set in, When the sleepless nights stretched on, when the fear took root deep in his gut, he'd talk and Calloway would hear every word. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, her breath slow and deliberate. So we don't stop with just them. Michael met her gaze, steady and unyielding. No, because this wasn't just about Calloway or Reeves anymore. It was about every man who had ever stood beside them, who had enabled them, who had shared in their cruelty. It was about all of them. Sarah exhaled, something hardening in her eyes. Good. Michael studied her for a long moment, noting the faint twitch of her fingers, the resolute set of her shoulders, the way she didn't look away. There was no hesitation in her, no trace of fear, just purpose. This wasn't his fight alone anymore. It belonged to both of them. Sarah shifted, her voice softening but no less certain. I want to be the one to tell him. Michael froze, his breath steady as he processed her words. Reeves. She nodded. When we're done. He considered her request, letting the weight of it settle between them. Then, finally, he gave a single nod. Sarah turned and walked toward the hallway, her footsteps silent against the worn floorboards. Michael watched her go, listening to the faint rustle of her clothing as she disappeared into the bedroom. He turned to the table, reaching for his jacket, the familiar weight settling over his shoulders like a second skin. This wasn't over. It would never be over, not for them, not for Calloway, not for Reeves, because true fear wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was the silence that followed, the long nights, the footsteps heard too close in the dark, the glance over the shoulder that never quite found peace. And now, for the rest of their lives, that fear would belong to them. Beside him. Michael and Sarah had prepared with meticulous care, spending 2 nights studying Reeves, memorizing his habits. He wasn't as careless as Calloway, but he carried the same arrogance, the same unshakable confidence that made men like him vulnerable. His weakness was a dive bar on the edge of town, a dimly lit hole in the wall far from prying eyes. It was a place where cops like Reeves gathered, where they could drink, laugh, and trade stories of the people they'd broken without consequence. Tonight, Reeves had lingered longer than usual, alone with no one waiting for him, no one to notice his absence. From the shadows of the alley behind the bar, Michael and Sarah watched, their car parked 2 streets away, out of sight of any cameras. They'd mapped out his routine. He'd leave through the back door, light a cigarette by his car, check his phone, and drive home. Except tonight, he wasn't going home. Michael adjusted his gloves, his breath slow and even. Beside him, Sarah stood focused, her eyes sharp, her breathing steady. Right on cue, Reeves stepped out into the night. He barely glanced around, his movements loose, comfortable, rolling his shoulders. He pulled a cigarette from his pocket and lit it with a flick of his lighter, the brief glow illuminating his face before fading into the dark. Michael moved first, his steps silent, his approach precise. Reeves didn't hear him, not until it was too late. In a flash, Michael's arm locked around Reeves's throat, his other hand pressing against the back of his head, cutting off any chance to scream or fight. Reeves let out a choked gasp, his hands clawing at Michael's arm, his body thrashing in a desperate bid for freedom. But Michael had done this before, too many times to count. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly how long it would take for Reeves's strength to falter. Sarah was already there, moving with swift precision. She pressed a thick cloth over Reeves's face, pulling it tight to blind him completely. His panic surged, his breathing ragged, his movements whirled and erratic. Michael tightened his grip, his voice low and calm. Stop fighting. Reeves didn't listen. He tried to kick out, to drive an elbow back, but Sarah was faster. A sharp strike to the back of his leg sent him buckling, his knee slamming into the pavement with a muffled thud. A strangled sound escaped him as Michael seized the moment, forcing Reeves's hands behind his back and securing them with zip ties, yanking them tight enough to bite into his skin. Sarah bound his ankles with another restraint, locking them together. Reeves gasped, his struggles growing weaker. Who are you? Michael shoved him forward, pinning him against the car, his knee pressing into Reeves's spine. He didn't answer. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let the reality of Reeves's helplessness sink in. Then, without a word, he and Sarah lifted him, dragging him away from the lot, away from his car, away from the world he thought he controlled. His muffled protest turned to choked, panicked noises. But he wasn't in charge anymore. For the first time in his life, he knew it. They didn't take him far. The destination was an abandoned auto shop just outside town, its walls scrawled with graffiti, its roof sagging on one side, the ground littered with broken glass and chunks of concrete. It was a forgotten place, free of cameras, witnesses, or anyone to hear him scream. Michael and Sarah drove in silence, Reeves bound and blindfolded in the back, his body shifting with every turn, every bump in the road. His breathing had slowed, but Michael could hear the fear in it, the way it settled in his chest, turning his frantic thrashing into something more calculated. He was trying to think his way out, to understand who had taken him, to figure out if this was about money or something deeper. Michael said nothing. Neither did Sarah. They let him stew in the uncertainty, let the fear tighten its grip, because this wasn't just about tonight. It was about every night that would follow. Every moment Reeves would spend looking over his shoulder, wondering when they'd come for him again. In the oppressive quiet of the night, silence spoke louder than any words could. By the time the car rolled into the deserted lot, Reeves had gone still, his earlier struggles abandoned. Michael cut the engine, the sudden absence of sound amplifying the tension. Sarah shot him a glance, her face a mask of unreadable emotion. But there was no hesitation in her movements as she pushed open her door. Michael mirrored her, stepping out into the chilly air, and together they hauled Reeves from the back seat. His body jolted at the rough handling, a weak kick flailing out as his breath caught, but the restraints held him fast. Their eyes met briefly, a silent agreement passing between them, and they dragged him toward the decrepit building. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of rust and neglect. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting jagged, shifting shadows across the walls and stirring clouds of dust that danced in the dim light. The room was a graveyard of forgotten industry, rusted workbenches, scattered tools, and the skeletal remains of old machinery littered the concrete floor. Without ceremony, Michael and Sarah dropped Reeves onto the ground, letting him hit hard enough to rattle his bones, a stark reminder of his vulnerability. He groaned, curling onto his side, his breaths coming in shallow, jagged bursts. The mask over his face kept him shrouded in darkness, amplifying his disorientation. Michael stood over him, watching for a moment before crouching down, forearms resting on his knees, head tilted as if studying a puzzle to hear. Reeves lay motionless, but Michael could sense the tension coiled within him, the quiet anticipation of a man bracing for the inevitable. Reeves's fingers twitched against the ropes, and when he spoke, his voice was raw, strained. "What do you want?" "Do." Michael didn't respond. Sarah stepped closer, arms crossed, her exhale slow and deliberate, carrying a weight of its own. Michael reached out, gripping Reeves's shoulder to roll him onto his back, letting his head rest against the icy concrete. He could feel the man's silent struggle to keep his breathing steady, to maintain some semblance of control. Leaning in, Michael's voice was low, almost intimate. "Not so fun being on this side, is it?" Reeves didn't answer, but his throat bobbed with a hard swallow. Michael tilted his head, his tone conversational but laced with menace. "I know you're thinking, trying to piece it together who we are, why you're here." Another swallow from Reeves, followed by a faint, "I don't." Michael cut him off, pressing a hand to Reeves's chest, just hard enough to make his breath hitch. "The problem is, you've done this to so many people. You can't even guess which one of us finally came back." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah broke it, her voice soft but edged with a chilling certainty. "And that's what should terrify you most." Reeves's breathing grew shallower, his body trembling under the weight of her words. Michael leaned closer, his whisper slicing through the stillness, "Because it means you'll never know who's watching." Reeves flinched, a small, involuntary movement that betrayed his fear. Michael let the silence stretch, let the words sink deep, wrapping around Reeves like a noose. Then he stood, rolling his shoulders, flexing his fingers, his stance loosening as if preparing for what came next. The abandoned auto shop felt alive with the weight of their purpose, the cold concrete beneath Reeves seeping into his aching limbs. He'd stopped fighting, his breath slow and measured, as if he'd begun to accept his fate. But Michael knew better. He'd seen men like Reeves over men who clung to the delusion that endurance would save them, that there was always a way out. Michael stepped forward, the faint scrape of his boots against the floor echoing in the hollow space. Sarah stood beside him, her presence steady, unyielding. She'd been quiet, watching, letting the moment build, letting the gravity of their actions settle. At the sound of Michael's approach, Reeves tensed, his body betraying his fear despite the mask that blinded him. Michael crouched again, his voice calm, almost friendly. "You think if you stay quiet, if you tough it out, this ends quicker." Reeves swallowed, the movement visible even in the dim light. Michael's head tilted slightly. "That's not how this works." The first blow came without warning, a clean, precise punch to Reeves's ribs that tore a strangled gasp from his throat. His body jerked, but the restraints held him pinned, his bound hands and useless legs offering no defense. Michael straightened, shaking out his hand, watching as Reeves wheezed, his chest heaving unevenly. Sarah stepped forward, her movements deliberate. Her first strike landed hard, her knuckles connecting with Reeves's jaw, snapping his head to the side. A pained grunt escaped him, his shoulders curling inward instinctively, but there was no escape. She hit him again, and again, each blow fueled by a deep, smoldering fury, a raw, unshakable force born from the night she'd lain broken, clutching the son who'd been ripped from her life. Michael didn't intervene. This was as much her reckoning as it was his. When Sarah finally stepped back, her breathing was slow, controlled, but her eyes burned with the fire of what they'd done. Reeves groaned, his head lolling forward, his body trembling from the onslaught. Michael crouched once more, his voice low and unyielding. "Listen to me, Reeves." He grabbed the front of Reeves's shirt, yanking him slightly forward, forcing his attention. "You can never admit what happened here. Because if you do, if you tell anyone what we did, they'll ask why." Reeves's breath hitched, his shoulders stiffening. Michael leaned closer, his grip tightening. "And if they ask why, they'll dig into every arrest you've made, every traffic stop, every case you buried because you said so." Reeves let out a slow, shuddering breath, the sound of a man realizing the trap he was in. Michael's voice softened, but the danger in it remained. And the same goes for Calloway. Reeves's hands twitched against the ropes. Michael tilted his head, his tone almost curious. "You already know what happened to him, don't you?" Reeves didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Michael knew the whispers would have started the moment Reeves was taken. Calloway would have been found by now bound, battered, and humiliated, his fear spreading like wildfire through the department. Sarah crouched beside Michael, her voice sharp, cutting through the haze. "That's why you'll keep your mouth shut. That's why you'll get up tomorrow and act like nothing happened. Because if you open that door, everything comes crashing down." Reeves swallowed hard, his trembling body betraying the storm inside him. Michael released his grip, standing slowly, rolling his shoulders as if shedding the weight of the moment. "You'll never know when we're watching," he said, his voice calm but heavy with promise. "You'll never know if we're close." Sarah rose beside him, her voice low, final. "But if you ever do this again, we'll be back." Michael turned, his boots echoing as he walked toward the exit. Sarah lingered for a heartbeat, her gaze fixed on Reeves, then followed without a word. Reeves would free himself eventually, stumbling into the night, broken and battered. And when he did, when he glanced over his shoulder every day for the rest of his life, that's when their justice would truly take root. It wasn't about the bruises or the pain. It was about the fear, a fear that would cling to him forever, a fear that now belonged to them all. Michael and Sarah would ensure it never faded. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when the call came in. A patrol officer spotted him first, staggering through the empty lot outside the abandoned auto shop. His uniform was torn, his face a swollen mess of bruises and crusted blood, his breathing ragged. He'd freed himself sometime during the night, but it had taken too long. His body weakened from the beating, his mind consumed by dread. The officer barely recognized him at first. Reeves, once a figure of smug authority, was now a trembling, hollow shell of himself. The department moved fast to contain the situation. By the time the morning shift began, word had spread like wildfire. 2 officers attacked, both found bound and brutalized in separate incidents. One was bad enough, but 2, that wasn't random. That wasn't coincidence. That meant someone was hunting them. The station was unnaturally quiet, the air thick with unspoken paranoia. No one voiced it, but the question hung heavy. Who did this? Who's next? Reeves sat in the station's medical room, his knuckles resting on his thighs, his head bowed. His face was a map of pain, bruises blooming across his jaw, blood drying in streaks. He'd barely spoken since they found him, offering no suspect, no statement, no details. What could he say that he'd been dragged into the dark, beaten, and left with a warning he couldn't ignore? Their voices still echoed in his mind, their word burrowing deep, stripping away the arrogance he'd once worn like armor. You'll never know when we're watching. You'll never know if we're close. But if you ever do this again, we'll be back. His hands curled into fists, pain shooting through his battered body. He knew the truth. Silence was his only option. Because if he spoke, if he let the truth slip, the world he'd built would unravel and he'd be the one left in the wreckage. In the dim glow of his living room, Calloway sat motionless, the faint hum of the television barely cutting through the fog in his mind. His wrists still bore the marks of the ropes that had bound him, raw and stinging, a constant reminder of the night his world unraveled. Found tied up in his own home, his face flushed with shame. He'd been unable to meet the eyes of the officers who freed him. Anger churned beneath his silence. But when pressed for answers, he only shook his head. To speak, to admit what had been done to him, would be to unlock a door the department couldn't afford to open. Questions would follow questions that would lead to investigations, to cases that should never have held up in court, to arrests built on nothing but their word, to complaints buried before they could see the light. He and Reeves had done this too many times. Michael had warned them, and now the weight of every choice, every shortcut, every lie pressed down on them, threatening to crush them entirely. Reeves wasn't faring any better. His breath came in uneven gasps as he sat in his own home, his mind racing through every possible scenario, every move he could make. But every path led to the same dead-end silence. The fear gnawed at him, a constant presence that burned hotter than his pride. He couldn't admit the truth, couldn't face the terror of knowing someone had stripped him of his power. By noon, the department had descended into a tense hush. Officers moved with caution, their eyes darting over their shoulders, their voices low and guarded. The laughter that had filled the station just days ago, shared by those who'd stood by Calloway and Reeves, who'd turned a blind eye, was gone. This wasn't just an attack on 2 men, it was an assault on everything they thought they were. Someone had sent a message, loud and clear, and the worst part, no one knew who. No witnesses, no suspects, no leads, just 2 officers who'd spent their careers instilling fear, now forced to taste it themselves. Deep down, they all knew this wasn't random. It wasn't over. In a quiet living room across town, Michael sat with the television muted, the news ticker scrolling silently across the screen. Reports of 2 officers assaulted in separate incidents flashed in bold letters, but he didn't need the words. He saw it all in the reporter's careful phrasing, in the department's PR officer dodging the camera's gaze. They were scrambling, caught on the wrong side of fear for the first time. Sarah sat beside him, her posture calm, but her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. She hadn't said much since they'd returned, but she didn't need to. The heavy tension that had clung to them for weeks had shifted into something colder, something final. Michael let out a slow breath, his eyes tracking the images of the police station on the screen, officers moving in and out, their faces tight with unease. The department was afraid, and fear was a force all its own. Sarah leaned back, her gaze steady. "They'll never admit it," she said softly. Michael nodded. "They don't have to." She tilted her head, studying him. "Do you think they understand?" He paused, letting the question settle, then nodded again. "They understand." A flicker of relief passed through Sarah's eyes, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. "Good," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael watched her, noting the way her shoulders had softened, the way the weight she'd carried for so long seemed just a fraction lighter. They weren't healed, neither of them would ever be, but this was a start. He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining, her warmth grounding him. They'd done what they set out to do, and now they would wait. The fear they'd planted in Calloway, in Reeves, in every officer who'd looked the other way, it would linger, a shadow that would never fade. Calloway's world had shrunk to the confines of his living room, where the television's flicker cast long shadows across the walls. Sleep eluded him, chased away by the relentless pounding in his skull. The doctors had called it a severe concussion, warning that the symptoms, dizziness, nausea, a high-pitched ringing in his ears, could linger for months, maybe years. They hadn't faded. Some days, the pressure in his head was so intense he could barely think, his thoughts slipping through his fingers like water. But worse than the physical pain was the fear. It clung to him, tightening his chest at every unfamiliar sound: footsteps outside, a car idling too long down the street, the creak of his own front door. He felt watched, hunted, certain that whoever had done this was still out there, waiting. Work was no longer an option. The concussion had dulled his reflexes, clouded his focus. The department hadn't fired him, not officially, but they'd stripped him of his badge, sidelined him with indefinite leave, treating him like a problem they didn't know how to solve. Reeves had it worse, found beaten and bound on the cold ground, his face swollen, his ribs cracked. He'd been left a shell of the man he'd once been. The physical wounds were bad enough, but the fear had broken him in ways the department couldn't ignore. He'd always been paranoid, but now he was a ghost, rarely leaving his house, his arrogance replaced by silence. He'd resigned without a fight, walking away from the force that had defined him, avoiding the bars and haunts where he'd once held court. His phone went unanswered, his life reduced to the four walls of his home, where the memory of that night played on a loop: the sound of their voices, the weight of their fists, the certainty that he'd never see them coming if they returned. He couldn't speak of it, couldn't admit that he'd spent his career doing to others what had been done to him. To face that truth would be to unravel everything he was. And that was the beauty of it. Michael and Sarah didn't need to return. The fear they'd instilled was a living thing, burrowing into Calloway and Reeves, haunting their every moment. It was there in the sleepless nights, in the shadows that seemed to move just out of sight, in the paranoia that grew like a weed in their minds. This was justice, not just the broken bodies or the shattered careers, but the knowledge that no matter how much time passed, no matter how desperately they tried to convince themselves it was over, it never would be. In their quiet home, Sarah sat curled on the couch, a mug of tea cradled in her hands, her eyes fixed on the soft glow of a candle flickering on the table. The news had moved on, the department left with no suspects, no leads, just an unsolved mystery whispered about in hushed tones. That was exactly how it needed to be. Michael stood at the kitchen counter, watching her, his heart heavy but steady. They'd dismantled the men who'd wronged them, stripped them of their power, left their lives in ruins. But the ache inside them hadn't faded. Sarah let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I should feel better," she said, her voice barely audible. Michael crossed the room, sitting beside her, his forearms resting on his knees. "You do." he said gently. She shook her head, her lips pressing together. Not completely. He didn't rush to fill the silence, letting her words hang between them. She was right, the pain was still there. A wound that would never fully heal. Nothing would bring Ethan back. Nothing would erase the sound of her sobs that night. The moment the world stopped, when they were told there was nothing to be done. But this was something. Michael took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, the quiet strength in her fingers. We didn't do this to feel better, he said. Sarah's shoulders relaxed, just slightly, her breath evening out. I know, she whispered. He squeezed her hand. We did it so they'd never do it again. She nodded, the weight on her chest lifting, if only a fraction. They'd never be whole again. But they were still here, standing together. And the men who tried to take everything from them, they'd never stand again. For now, that was enough.